Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for virtual breakfast today. I will be your host, Nicole Ritchie. I am a field crops agronomy educator in Southwest Michigan. Let's introduce Dr. Christy Sprague. She'll be talking about late season weed control today.
Thanks, Nicole, and good morning, everyone. I think I started at possibly one of the first virtual breakfasts this year, and I'm going to kind of complete it out talking about just weed control in general and some of the different fall applications and things that we can do at this point. One of the things this year, just like the last few years, we've had some weed control challenges, and there have been several weed escapes in some of our different fields. And particularly, we usually see that in some of our lower growing crops like soybeans, maybe sugar beets, dry beans, so forth. I would say these are kind of some of our tougher weed control challenges or escapes that we've seen this year. Quite a bit of velvet leaf, lamb's quarters, the two ragweed species. We still see mare's tail pop up here and there. And I would say that some of our amaranth species, particularly water hemp this year, has kind of reared its ugly head in different places that it hasn't been. So these are some of the ones that you want to keep an eye on. So now is a good time as we're kind of wrapping up the season to figure out where some of those fields are with some of these different problem weeds. And here's just a few pictures from some different fields across the state. And in particular, again, the water hemp has been one of our bigger challenges. So what can we do at this point in time? Well, right now, we're kind of we are too late for, too late for any season herbicide applications. But what we can, again, do is really scout for some of those weed escapes and really evaluate the effectiveness of this last year's herbicide program. Again, this gives us that opportunity to identify new weeds in some of our fields and really look at what might be some of the herbicide resistance that are out there. And as we see some of those weeds, we all know that we've got water hemp that's resistant to a lot of different herbicides, in particular glyphosate, a lot of our ALS inhibitors, and we do have some populations out there that are resistant to atrazine and also to some of our PPO inhibitors like Flexstar, Reflex, Cobra. If you're coming across some of these different issues, just remember that the MSU Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab does testing. Dr. Aaron Hill, our weed diagnostician, does screening for a lot of those herbicide resistances, particularly if you're starting to see new weed problems in your fields, whether it's water hemp, Palmer amaranth, some of the different ragweed species. I know Aaron's tested some different grass species that have been more difficult to control to see if we have any issues. So if you're seeing some of these fields or weeds as you're driving around looking at these fields and trying to figure out, hey, these should have been controlled, and you think that there might be some resistance problems, it's always a good idea to go ahead and get those tested. Erin usually likes to have those weed seeds in from those different plants by November 15th. And really what she asks for is for you to collect 5 or more weeds with mature seed. And there's some really good fact sheets out there that Erin has put together showing where those seeds are, and you can submit those. So just as as you're driving around looking at your fields, if you think you have some resistance issues, it's always a good thing to get those tested. So if you have a weed guide, you can find in the back of the weed control guide the screening for herbicide resistance form, or you can go ahead and go to the MSU Plant and Pest Diagnostic website and find that form to fill out and get your weed seeds sent in. So what else can be done? So if we've got some of those weed escapes out there, obviously if it's at a low population, it's always good to try to get those out of the field before they drop the seed and before you run your combine through it, because the last thing you want to do is spread those weeds further. Additionally, if you've got some larger places in the field, sometimes it's always great to harvest around those weedy areas or maybe harvest some of those weedy fields last. Again, you want to kind of keep that spread in the combine from going from field to field at a minimum. It's always good to be able to, if you're in a field, blow off some of those weed seeds. It doesn't get all of them off, but at least you can kind of reduce that from going from one field to the next. Another thing that people have done, particularly as we start seeing soybeans drying down a lot quicker, we've got soybean harvest already starting. In some cases, we have some of those weeds that are out there that are still green, but we want to get out there and be able to harvest the soybean plants because those are ready to go. There are some different harvest aids that are available in soybeans, and really these are just to be able to take care of those green weeds that are out there. Again, in the past, they're really not commonly used in soybeans, but we're starting to see kind of an uptick, especially as people are starting to think about, well, can we further along some of these soybean crops? And this is one thing that myself and Dr. Manny Singh and one of my grad students, Ian Waldecker, is working on. And we'll be able to share some more results after this year's work. But in general, if we're looking at a harvest date or pre-harvest herbicide for weed control, we've got 6 different options that can work fairly well. Obviously, glyphosate, if we don't have a glyphosate-resistant weed, is one of the products that we can use. Depending on if you're using it in a Roundup Ready crop or a non-Roundup Ready crop, the pre-harvest interval is slightly different. One of the other ones that works well from a standpoint of kind of desiccating those weeds so they can go through a combine without causing issues is germoxone. One of the challenges with germoxone, again, is it is a restricted use pesticide, so there's some extra training, as well as that pre-harvest interval is actually 15 days. So again, that gives you, it's a little bit longer harvest window that you have to wait. There are a few other herbicides that can be used, things like AIM, Clarity, and Sharpen. In particular, Sharpen and AIM have a much shorter pre-harvest interval. For example, Sharpen's fairly good at drying down things like ragweed, some of the pigweed species, especially if we don't have the group 14 or PPO resistant water hemp that's out there. So those are some of the options. Again, usually not commonly used, but if you are trying to get out there and harvest and you need to clean up some of those fields, prior to that, without having those weeds gum up your combine, we do have some options out there. Some of the different considerations, if you're going to use a harvest aid, one of the things to think about is making sure that you match that herbicide to the weed that you're trying to control. In particular, if it's lamb's quarters, usually glyphosate is a pretty good herbicide to use. But again, if you have a resistance issue like glyphosate-resistant water hemp, you would need to choose another herbicide to do that. Usually the stage of soybean is also important. Many of these products are only labeled to be applied when we have mature soybeans, no green pods, particularly glyphosate, AIM, and Clarity. If we look at germoxone and Sharpen, those pods need to be greater than 65% mature, which is usually 30% or less seed moisture. I know some soybeans that we harvested yesterday were around anywhere between 10 and 13%. So that seed moisture is going down fairly quickly in some of the different varieties and early plantings that have happened. With those, we can use germoxone or Sharpen. And another thing to look for is about 70% leaf drop. A couple other things to look at when you're looking at harvest aids. Some of these have rotation restrictions. For example, if you're using Clarity, you would not be planting wheat. So again, just make sure you're aware of those. And then there are some more restrictions with sugar beets and dry beans, particularly with things like Sharpen that can carry over to the next year. Remember, we do have a crop rotation table in the back of the weed control guide, table 12, which can give you all those rotation restrictions. And if you want any more information on harvest dates and soybeans, you can look at pages 96 and 97 in the weed control guide. So what other things can we do this fall? Well, one of the things we can also do is look at fall herbicide applications to manage some of the weeds that are out there. In particular, one that's always helpful is managing herbicide-resistant horseweed or mare's tail. Again, most of our mare's tail, we do have a spring emergence, but we also have quite a bit of late summer and fall emergence to where we would have mare's tail that looks like this. In addition to mare's tail, there's also a lot of other weeds that we can manage this fall. So what fields should we be considering for fall herbicide applications? Obviously, no-till fields, also some of our reduced tillage fields, particularly if somebody's going out there with vertical tillage, we're not getting all the weeds controlled. So some of those herbicide applications can help with that. Other places, particularly where we have some heavy infestations of some of our perennial weeds like dandelion, Canada thistle, some of the biennial weeds like white campion or white cockle, we can apply some of those herbicides this fall to clean up some of those fields. And really this year with our early harvested fields, we're going to see a lot of excessive winter annual growth. So some of our, if we've got nice weather like we've been having, we're going to start to see a lot more growth. So those herbicide applications can be helpful at that point. So when is the best time to make these fall herbicide applications? Really, anytime that those weeds are still actively growing. So we'll hear what Jeff has to say as far as the rest of our fall, is what the temperatures are and if those weeds are going to be growing. The ideal daytime temperatures are usually around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or greater. Usually we say kind of a range between 40 and 60 degrees is ideal. However, there are some winter annuals and some perennials that are more tolerant to frost and can actually be controlled after we have a light frost. So in particular, our perennial weeds like dandelions and Canada thistle, when we make those herbicide applications, in particular things that translocate like glyphosate, even after a frost, what's happening is those food reserves are going down to the roots of those plants or the rootstock, and that also brings down the herbicide. So many times, even after a light frost, we actually will get better control of some of those perennial weeds. So in general, we've done a lot of fall applications, and a lot of times we can make those applications all the way through mid-November. Now, if we've got a really early winter, sometimes that doesn't always work, but in general, usually through mid-November. We usually have two different strategies we can use. We can use non-residual herbicides, or we can use a burn down herbicide that will give us some residual control to the next year. In some cases, those may limit what your rotational crops are. So those kind of consider that. I did put an article in the MSU News this morning that talks about some of the different strategies. So take a look at that, and it outlines some of those key factors. So again, many of these fall herbicide applications can be used either prior to corn or soybean. Here's a couple pictures that show control of dandelion from a fall burn down application to no fall burn down. And again, this is in the spring of the year. So many times we're able to reduce some of those weeds that we're trying to deal with in the spring. And it really helps reduce the variability of some of the winter annuals that are out there, in particular mare's tail. And in some cases, again, if we've got spring emergence, like with things like mare's tail, we may also still need a burn down herbicide. Since one of the key weeds we're going after is going to be mare's tail, in addition to things like chickweed, dead nettle, and so forth, many times we're using glyphosate plus something else with our fall applications. In this case, we're using many times things like 2,4-D or Sharpen or dicamba in those burn down applications in the fall. So kind of keep that in mind. Another quick thing I'd like to mention this year is as we're harvesting, we're going to get weed in early. I'm sure maybe Dennis will make a few comments about that, but it's also going to be important to control those weeds prior to planting wheat. And from some work that we did, it really shows that if you're comparing no-till to a no-till with a fall burn down, in many cases, we might see some benefits there from a yield standpoint. Some of our fall burn down herbicide applications that we can make in wheat prior to wheat emergence are glyphosate, right? That's probably our most common. The one thing that we would miss would be that glyphosate resistant horseweed or mare's tail. In that case, we can add Sharpen either at an ounce or 2 ounces, and making sure that we include methylated seed oil and AMS with that. And then also gramoxone is another product that we can use. In general, I think we're, because of some of the restrictions with gramoxone, probably some of the more common burn down applications are going to be glyphosate plus Sharpen to help control some of that mare's tail. Another option we can do is looking at a fall post-emergence herbicide application, and that's usually when wheat's about 2 to 3 leaves. So we'll plant the wheat, we'll wait for that wheat to emerge when it's at that 2 to 3 leaf stage. We've got several herbicides that are labeled for control. Those applications are really effective at controlling winter annual weeds that emerge with the wheat crop. One of the downfalls might be that they may not provide enough residual control through the spring. Some of the different herbicides that are labeled that are also effective on things like emerged horseweed or mare's tail would be Husky, Talinor, and Culex. And also some of the different grass herbicides like Osprey or Powerflex or Axial Bold are also helpful in controlling some of our winter annual grasses. Probably looking at windgrass, annual bluegrass, rough stalk bluegrass. With those different weeds, Osprey is probably our best bet to cover all of those. Powerflex would work well on windgrass and also annual bluegrass. And we see some of the benefits of axial bold with windgrass and rough stalk bluegrass. So just a couple pictures that show the difference between a fall application and a spring application on windgrass control with Osprey. Another thing I would also mention is the time of planting wheat can also affect if or when you should be putting on a fall application. Over the last couple of years, with some funding by the Michigan Wheat Board, we've actually looked at September versus an late October planting. And in general, we're going to see a lot more weed issues with our earlier planted wheat. And in that case, with some of our fall applications, we've done a very good job of controlling some of those winter annual weeds to where we're actually seeing fairly good control throughout the season. Another option with fall herbicide applications in wheat is it gives us a little bit more flexibility on being able to frost seed red clover. And we have several different options that we can use. And those options are outlined in the MSU Weed Control Guide. So with that, with our fall applications and winter wheat, usually we can make those all the way through mid-November and get some very good control. And again, really those would be focused on more of our early planted wheat, which we're going to see this year. So we do have some resources out there. We have our website, msuweeds.com. And we have the weed control guide. The new weed control guide, the 2025 guide, will be out in December for the pavilion meeting. Our current one is on the website if you have any questions about fall weed control. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Christy. We're going to go ahead and get started on some questions. So we've got some questions for Christy here. Christy, isn't the fall height of the weeds an issue for herbicide use?
The fall height of the weeds?
Yep. I'm thinking this refers probably to maybe soybean desiccation going on or anything like that. Is that an issue, the height of the weeds for using herbicides right now?
So from a pre-harvest application, obviously trying to get good coverage on that, particularly with the contact herbicides are important. So making sure that you're able to get your boom height up high enough. As far as some of the fall applications, most of the time with a lot of our winter annuals and some of the different perennials that we'll be dealing with, a lot of those are going to be a little bit lower growing. So after harvest, we have those options.
Thank you. Fall emerging weeds seem to be delayed by dry soil this year. Do you expect this to reduce winter annuals this year or just delay them?
I think we're going to end up still seeing them. I think we'll probably be delayed a little bit. I think if you look at some of the different areas, they probably haven't taken off quite yet. But as Jeff was saying, we're probably going to get a half inch to possibly an inch in the next week or so. And I think once we really don't need a whole lot of rain to get some of those winter annual seeds to germinate and emerge because a lot of them are close to the soil surface and they don't need a lot of rain to be able to emerge. So be on the lookout for that. So once we.
All right. You froze for just a second there. What was the very last part that you said?
Sorry.
Be on the lookout for that.
Yeah, be on the lookout for those weeds to take off once we start getting a little bit of water because they really don't need a lot of rainfall to be able to germinate.
Perfect, thank you. Economics and reducing input costs will be a hot topic during the fall and winter for most farmers. So, what might the least cost program look like for this fall?
So for this fall, I think the where you what you want to do is look at what the benefits versus the costs are. So if you're planting, let's say we're talking about wheat, let's say you're planting wheat and all of a sudden you see a lot of winter annual weed growth, you may want to consider using the fall applications this year. And most of the time, if we've got good wheat growth, we don't need to come in with a spring herbicide application. So that'll take care of your weed control for the season. So again, it just really depends. Wheat is a tremendous competitor with weeds. So if we can start fairly clean this fall and we've got good wheat growth, we don't usually have to worry about it next spring. As far as trying to clean up some fields, if you've got a field and you've harvested early, there's a lot of silage coming off right now. We have the opportunity to where there's going to be a lot of chickweed growth, a lot of mare's tail growth. It probably is a good idea to go ahead and try to get some of those fields under control, those weeds, and particularly if you have some perennial weeds. Perennial weeds, particularly dandelion, thistle, they're harder to control in the spring. Fall's a great time to clean up some of those fields that have some perennials and biennials that are issues.
Awesome, thank you. Another question for you, Christy. You mentioned many weed escapes in our lower growing crops this year. What are some of the main reasons why you saw this problem?
I think one of the biggest issues that we had this year is earlier we had a lot of rain mid-season, and I think that really helped or had some of those weeds emerge later in the season. For example, a lot of water hemp came up, a lot of grasses. There's a lot of grass weed escapes that we've seen. So those are some with those later rainfalls that really helped promote germination of some and emergence of some of those weeds. Another thing is we've had some more challenges with some of the water hemp control this year. So I think that's one thing we're going to have to keep an eye on and really focus on, again, making sure we have a full, broad program to help manage that. And we're seeing a lot of water hemp spread throughout the state that hasn't been in areas where it was previously.
Thanks. One more for you, it looks like. You referred to windweed. I think this is referring to the windgrass that you talked about. Um, is it called something else in other regions, or is it is this more of a regional problem? Some people are not familiar with it.
Sure. There's windgrass. Predominantly where we see windgrass in the state is in the Thumb region and kind of Saginaw Valley up into the Thumb. We do have things like rough stalk bluegrass, and that if you're growing wheat, you're going to see that that matures much quicker than the wheat does. So if you start seeing a grass that is a golden brown color before your wheat starts to turn, that is rough stalk bluegrass, and we've seen that become more of a problem, and that's actually shown up in many places in the state.
Great, thanks, Christy. All right, sorry, not Phil. Jeff, we're going to turn to you with some questions. With La Nina gaining control, what are the chances that El Nino will come in during the winter and change the long-term forecast?
Well, I guess we really expect it. We've had El Nino in the past, last winter, for example. This year is the opposite phase, is the cool. And we'll be looking at, so chances for El Nino are real, almost, they're not zero, but they're really, really small. Much higher probability that, again, La Nina will be the rule here later this fall and then into the winter and probably into the early spring. And that's the major influence on those long-term outlooks. And that's the one that typically is La Nina conditions are associated with more winter-like conditions over there, or more severe, especially variability and especially above normal precipitation or more than normal snowfall. So that's where all that's La Nina.
Thank you. Got another one for you. Would you please explain why there has been so much morning dew with so little rain lately, and do the plants derive a benefit from the same?
That's an interesting question, and I mentioned sort of jokingly, I mentioned California, but one of the interesting things about the last couple of weeks, as the landscape is most of the state has really dried off quickly, even in the areas that were wet, including here locally, where we were much wetter than normal for a lot of July and August. As the landscape dries out, it becomes much more variable, and we see bigger swings. And although it is as we all know, the daylight is decreasing over 3 minutes per day now, and it's darker longer. But it's been noticeable to be even in the mid 80s during the daytime. So pretty warm, actually pretty. But notice that the humidities have been relatively low, and that's counter to what we think about when you're mentioning these dews. But the issue is that with that dry air, the air temperature falls farther and it falls much more quickly than it does if we have more humidity in the air. So we've had daytime temperatures in the low and mid 80s, but we've had nighttime temperatures way down into the 50s, and that reached the dew point of the atmosphere quickly because of that cooling. And the result was, in most of these days, and also with clear skies, relatively few clouds, the surface cooled off fast, and we got dew, not just dew, but extended dew and heavier dew than normal on an almost daily basis. So it's a situation we don't see that often, and at least not for extended periods. But it has to do with it's dry air, but at night under those conditions, with clear, calm conditions or relatively fair conditions, we see lots of overnight dew formation, it's a little bit unusual for Michigan climate. We usually have more clouds, but it's been an interesting 2 weeks.
And do you think that has any effect on the plants at all?
Yes, actually, that's a good question. It turns out, and if we had time, we could talk. There actually have been measurements of dew accumulation. It's not an easy thing to do, and you've got to usually you get some kind of a grad student out there at night with filter paper and so forth, and it's a pretty painstaking way of looking at water. But it turns out it's really small. But still, with some of the instruments now we have, for example, in EnviroWeather, looking at volumetric soil moisture, you can actually pick that up. There is a little bit of a temporary gain. There's also, remember too, even under dry conditions, there's some water moving upward in the soil profile with capillary action. That's a little bit as well. So it helps, but it does not, the downward pattern almost always is still downward in terms of how much water is available there for plants. So it does at least temporarily relieve some of the stress on plants if they have the stress, but it's not a long-term solution. It's a very temporary thing. And once the sun, you turn it on the next day with low humidities and so forth, and you have re-evaporate the water pretty quickly. It's usually only a few hours, and by the mid-morning, of course, you go out there, or depending on where your exposure is, how much sun you've got, that dew's gone. So it's just but it's a temporary break for the plant. When you really have to worry about impacts for most plants, of course, is when you don't get relief even at night with that dew. And for most of the state, we're not there. Fortunately, that only happens in really serious drought situations here in Michigan. But it does help, but it's usually pretty temporary.
Thank you. With all this dry weather, I know a lot of people have been putting off some winter wheat planting. Now we've got some moisture coming into the profile. Do you want to speak to that at all?
Or we might ask Dennis if he'd care. I know that's been obviously it's been a concern for a lot of people, and nobody wants to plant. And I'm on a coarse textured soil where I live, and I just am shocked at how dry the top several inches are. There would be no if I planted right now, there would be no germination. It's just not enough water. But change is coming, and again, it depends on how much water you get. But Dennis, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the goal when you're planting wheat is to get uniform emergence, and the issue right now is the dry soil conditions. And so that raises questions about what do I do so that I can manage it in a way that I can get the best uniform emergence. So the few options, go out and see what you have for soil moisture, which means going out and digging in the soil. Fields usually have more than one soil type, so you want to go to the heavier areas and the light areas, dig down and see if you have moisture at depth. If you do, you can plant wheat deeper. You can plant down 2.5 inches deep. When you do that, you're increasing the risk that some of your seed will germinate, but it won't fully emerge because of the depth that is planted. So you need to increase your seeding rate. But only plant deeper and at a higher seeding rate if there's moisture down there to be had. If you're digging and you're not finding moisture, there's no point in doing that. You're better off just to hold off and wait. So the other option is you just hold off and wait till you rain and get some soil moisture. in there. So we've got our little research plot planner here. We tried to no-till with it, but of course we don't have enough weight. It rode right on the top of the ground. It wouldn't even go in, so we can't no-till. Usually no-till will conserve some moisture, but so yeah, I guess you got to kind of get out and look at the field and the soil conditions to determine what's going to be the best option. And then if you are going to plant, increase your seeding rate, because maybe not all of it will germinate and emerge and survive. So that's probably the majority of what you need to be thinking about. And it's also very helpful to have some rain in the forecast for this next week. So.
And just to follow up on that too, Dennis, as we saw those maps, the comments are spot on. The problem with Michigan is it's so variable, and there are still portions of the state, especially in the southeast lower, where we've had so much rain and water over the last few weeks that there's definitely it's a very different situation. There's water. It's going to be a little bit at depth now because of the last week and a half or so, but there are other places like the portions of upper and certainly portions of the central lower peninsula that did not have that rain, where it's going to be dry all the way down. And remember, in the backdrop, right now in the fall, this is typically when our soil moisture, our volumetric soil moisture, the amount of water actually there, it's the lowest we see during the whole annual cycle. And it's typically the lowest moisture we see. So you may dig and in some of those areas and not see really much water at all, and it gets trickier to try. And you really need to look at that outlook, probably that forecast, and hope where you need to have water added through the top, because it's in some of those drier areas in the state, there's not going to be much at depth, but in other areas there will. So it's location is really important.
Yeah, and another thing I've been watching is soil temperatures. Winter wheat prefers soil temperatures in the 55 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit range. And wheat, with these abnormally warm days we've been having, we've seen soil temperatures during the day climb up into the mid 70s. Yeah. And so we're not, you get further south in the plain states and things like that, then their soil temperatures will warm up into the 80s, which that hinders germination. So I don't think we've reached that level here, but it's something to keep an eye on.
And there's a direct link too that with those temps and the water content. And the drier the soil is, the warmer it's going to get, especially with sunny conditions. So if we do get, hopefully, a few tenths or half an inch or so of water here, that will really help keep at least the daytime temperatures down into a more favorable limit. But when you dry the landscape out, you see those huge swings from night to day. But especially during the daytime, they're going to be way above where they typically are at this time of the year.
Thank you, Jeff and Dennis. One more question for Christy. Someone has noticed more cocklebur and soybeans late this season. Is this something to be concerned about?
I think it's one of those weeds that, we kind of had it pretty well under control, but we're starting to see it show up in more fields. So if you're seeing it in your fields, making sure that you have a plan to control it the following year. There are some different programs that we can use to hopefully clean those fields up.
Great, thank you. And with that, we're going to wrap it up for today and for the season. Thank you all for coming. And thank you once again to our specialists for speaking at our virtual breakfast this year. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.